We're going to continue our series about the American experiment from the theoretical to the practical via conversations from the conference tables to dinner tables. We're going to do this over the course of videos and podcasts by sharing our own experiences, asking some questions, challenging our beliefs. Plus, soon, because we've already talked about this, we'll be asking other voices to join us with their perspectives. So with that being said, let me get back over here to the right screen, and I'm going to bring them up one at a time in no certain order. But there's Eric. There's John. It's like magic. How you guys doing?
Hey, good. How are you?
We're good. I think we're settling in. We're starting to have some good flow. I'm getting some really good feedback. And I do think it's time. I'm saying it publicly as I'm putting pressure on the two brains of this organization. You're the two smart ones. Next 2 or 3 weeks, maybe even a week or so, I think we should start bringing some guests on. I think it's time. Let's get some input.
It is. It's time to hear others' perspectives so that people do not feel like that they're pigeonholed into the way they think. So I think it's wise of us to hear other perspectives, because we need to be able to say that there can be two different perspectives on a topic, but come to a rational, logical solution about how to move forward in our country instead of being so divisive.
Yeah, I agree. And the great thing about the world we live in now with videos and podcasts is we do not have to stay linear on our conversations. In other words, our conversations do not have to be mapped out on a timeline of the American history. So we can jump backwards, we can go forwards. So we can talk about topics that are maybe around the social culture now. We can talk about things that are going on right this minute, and then we can jump back and talk about stuff about the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or the founding. So I kind of have enjoyed that part of it so far. So real quick, have either one of you gotten some feedback? Eric, I know, have you sent this to some folks and had some positive feedback so far?
Yeah, I've had some really good comments on Facebook so far. People saying that they've learned a lot. They've enjoyed these conversations. I think we definitely need to bring some guests on, show some different perspectives. But I think there's a lot of stuff that John and I can talk about that people appreciate hearing in detail. And it doesn't seem like there's just not enough time to cover everything that we could talk about. So between what we can talk about and bringing the guests in, I think there's a lot of content we can put out there for people. There's a lot that I think people appreciate. If they haven't learned it once already, learning it. And for a lot of people, it's just a reminder of what they learned back in the day.
Well, let's do this. Let's use that as a good jumping off point, because last week we did a recap of a conversation, and kind of that was the genesis of last week's show, rehashing the conversation about the Constitution. But last week we focused on associations, because that made John really happy to talk about that, and lobbying. So let's just do this. Let's kind of recap it real quick. John, tell everybody why that topic was so close to your heart, and then let's kind of continue down that road a little bit, because it directly affects how things go from bills to laws.
Right. And by the way, I can't see or hear Eric, so if we need to ping pong.
Well, Eric, I can hear him, and I think everybody else can. But Eric, click back out while John's talking, and click right back in, buddy.
So. I tell you why associations and the lobbying are near and dear to me. Clint, did I lose you?
Nope, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just the military, being in the military for as long as I was, there's a camaraderie that was created in the military and still exists. And when you step out of the military and you come into the civilian population, unless you go into law enforcement, first responders, something like that, there's not a camaraderie that's happening in America. And I felt like, belonging to something that would interest you, that you could get behind, made sense. So I started doing a lot of research on associations and civic organizations, and found that the 92,000 exist in America with these varying missions. It would be beneficial if Americans would get behind those associations and realize how influential they are when it comes to lobbying, when it comes to bills being passed or put before Congress. And it just seems like, we mentioned last week AARP and AAA and these type of associations, but there needs to be an association of Americans that really, come together and say, you know what, we believe in us and what the founding fathers believed in, and we're not going to let what has happened, which I call it I use the word hijack. We're not going to allow America to be hijacked by whether it's corporate greed, whether it's government corruption, whatever you want to call it. We're not going to allow that to happen because there's 330 million of us, and there's 546 elected or appointed officials in Washington and the three branches, and we should have a larger voice than we are actually using right now.
Well, I got a couple things on that, but let's make sure. Eric, say hi and see if John can hear you, sir.
I can hear you guys fine. Can you guys hear me?
John, can you hear him?
Yes.
Awesome. All right, we're back on track then. So based off what you just said, John, I want to say two things, and then whoever wants to jump in first. There ought to be an association of Americans. I thought that's kind of what our political parties were supposed to do, represent our different perspectives off the Constitution. And then second, I think you said that people need to understand the power behind associations. I also think, though, and I'm not going to throw unions in here because that I would love to have a show about unions, but I also think people should know what their associations or organizations really stand for, because a lot of times the reason I support an organization is because my mom and dad did. Just like the reason I go to church, what's what my mom and dad did. And at some point, I think being free thinking enough to really research, why does this association, what does it really believe? What does this organization really stand for? Does this union really do what it says it's going to do? Would you both agree with that? Is that a problem?
I think I've got a speech that I do when I'm asked to come speak called "What Kind of Mayonnaise Do You Eat?"
And that sounds like a horrible speech, but continue, sir.
Well, it's because in America, we eat the mayonnaise we grew up on. We eat the ketchup. We drink Pepsi in the Columbia, South Carolina, because that's a Pepsi city. But in Chattanooga, Tennessee, we're Coca-Cola. And so I think we've been marketed to as it's the old Ford versus Chevy. I'd rather push a Chevy than drive a Ford. And so there's just been this marketing that's been going on for years in America where, if it wins on Sunday, we're going to drive it on Monday. We're going to go buy it, and we're going to beat our chest. And I want that same patriotism, that same tenacity to come back into America. I say, you know what? I'm proud to be an American. I'm proud of the principles in America, and that has got to come through uniting. And that's why United States of America.
Yeah, first of all, I'm all for an anti-Pepsi association if you're ready to start that. Unless they want to be a sponsor of the show, then I love Pepsi, of course, rock on. But don't you think that one of the things that I feel that as a conservative we try to gloss over, and I'm not saying we gloss over it, I just think sometimes we feel if we acknowledge the flaws of our country, that somehow we're validating it. And I don't think that's a good way to represent our views. In other words, it's okay to have hard conversations about the bad stuff we've done too as a country. You have to, right? One of y'all, don't y'all agree?
Well, Eric and I talked about we've talked about it. People ask Eric and I all the time, and I know they ask you, Clint, are we too far gone to turn this ship around? And I'll tell them absolutely not. Because there's an undertow in America right now where people are raising their head up. They've been burrowed down so long just trying to survive that things have gone by them without them noticing. And I do think that there are some heads raising up in America saying, hold on, we need to stop, draw a line. Let's figure out what we need to do. Otherwise, this experiment that we talk about is going to go off a cliff.
Eric, do you think, though, we're at a place to where I can see, and this is something I've come to realize over the last few years, we can't just talk about the greatness of our country without also talking about the flaws, right? I mean, don't you have to acknowledge our shortcomings? If our flaws are so great, then if our success is so great, we also have to be able to talk about the hard stuff.
So I think what's crucial to the conversation today is to remember that for all the bad things that America has done in the past, all the bad parts of our history, that for 240 plus years, we have progressed. We have gotten better. The original promises of the Constitution, the original promises of the Declaration of Independence, those ideals were not are fantastic ideals, but they were not ideals that were applied to everybody in the late 1700s. But over 240 years, we've worked hard as a country to allow those ideals to apply to everyone. We fought a civil war. We went through Jim Crow. We went through Reconstruction. We went through the civil rights era. We just celebrated, by the way, yesterday, 100 years of women having the right to vote in America. Now, the interesting part about that is that we went for a long time in America and women didn't have the right to vote. But there aren't any women alive who couldn't vote before, because you'd have to be 121 years old now. So women under 121, every woman alive in America now, by the time they were 21, had the right to vote. We have worked hard as Americans to live up to the promises of 1776, to the promises of the Constitution. It's been a long struggle. It's been a climb. It's been a crawl. It's been difficult. But that's what we have to be proud of. A lot of the bad stuff in our history, we've learned our lessons from and gotten better. Does that mean we're perfect today? Absolutely not. Does it mean that we have the right structure in place and the right people to keep making America better and include as many people as possible in the American dream, the American ideal? Absolutely. And that's what our job is. I think that's what the three of us are here trying to do, is teach people how America should work for us and can work for us. And if you're feeling left out, listen to people like us talk about how you can be included. We'd be glad to reach out and help you understand how to be included.
Well, and but I also think too that if people reach out, and again, I've said it just a minute ago, and I'll say it again. I think it's important for us to learn to listen, because I am a big believer that John's story about growing up in America, he and I are going to have a lot of similarities because we have maybe some background in place, but it's going to be different too. And if we start dismissing other people's experience in America and go, yeah, but that's not what we meant when we started it, I feel that that's how we get these people, they just become silent. And then we see them later kind of protesting or being upset. And I think it's on us to learn to listen. It doesn't validate, it doesn't dismiss the greatness of our country to hear other perspectives. I think we're missing sometimes listening, because I really don't care what Eric Buchanan or John Ballinger think. And I really don't care about the knowledge in your brain until I know you care about me. Right. I mean, that's just the way it's got to be. And I'm really excited about this stuff because I want people to tell their story. The other side of that is, just because you have a story doesn't mean it's indicative of a bigger problem. You know what I'm saying?
Yep. Those are all. I will tell you, Clint, I'll do this quick commercial. So I've been involved with an organization called Braver Angels that is focused on empathetic patriotism, trying to learn and listen from the other side. And I won't go into it too long. I've mentioned it before in one of our previous shows, but the whole idea is to bring people of the blue persuasion, the red persuasion together, to have that conversation, to listen to each other, to find the places for compromise. And I also have found those conversations have been very useful in pointing out that the vast majority of people are not the extremists that we're scared of about the other side, that most people are willing to work and listen to each other and don't believe in the most extreme positions of their own side, and that those they can teach each other what are the really big concerns that we can work on, and what are those things that say their political party tries to make a big concern out of when it's really not something that most people agree with.
And John, I think what happens if we don't listen to the other side, then they're not going to listen to us. And then we're both deprived of those aha moments. The things that John, in your brain, no one else cares about unless they're willing to listen to you.
Yeah, and I was in the store last night, and I reached up. My wife had said, go get a loaf of bread. And I reached up to get it. It was $3.69, and I just held my hand on it and thought, this is $4 with tax, and what's going on in America with people out of work, income inequality between the wealthy and the middle class kind of eroding to the lower class. And I said, until we listen and understand what's going on as elected officials, especially, people aren't going to listen to us, because if people don't know how much you care, they don't care how much you know.
That's right.
And we have got to have elected officials and people in charge of associations that represent people that care about people selflessly, knowing that to correct this experiment that's gone off the rails is going to be difficult to get it back on the rails and move it forward.
So let's use that as a kind of a jumping off point, because I think I love that conversation, and I think this is good for people to hear, and hopefully it'll be the first of many of these little segments we have. But I want to kind of revisit what we did last week, because I don't think we finished talking about the associations, and this is where we can kind of give some of the the wisdom. I'm giving you a compliment, both of you. Wisdom, which comes with age, which means you're just really old, smart people. So let's talk about the lobbying and a bill going from a bill to a law. And Eric, this was kind of a suggestion on you to tie these two together. So what did you have in mind?
Yeah, so the context of how lobbying and associations can affect what laws go into place in the United States and in the states, that's a crucial conversation. Understanding the rules that we have to live by, the rules that give certain businesses advantages over others, that enforce certain limits on your freedom, on your activities, that can put you in jail. All of those things come from laws, and associations, citizens can influence those laws. But a big problem we have is people don't understand how that process works, and they feel left out. Let me start with some real simple basics. For those of us who are old enough, Schoolhouse Rock was pretty darn good. And Schoolhouse Rock started off with one of their Saturday morning cartoons being, "I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill." Anybody who doesn't know what Schoolhouse Rock is, who's listening to this, go Google it. The videos are available on YouTube. You should watch Schoolhouse Rock. There's some other good ones about the founding fathers. It's great stuff. It's still out there. So the "I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill," what is it? Well, it's the story of basically Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. How did our founding fathers decide that the laws would be made in the United States? So in its most simple terms, a law has to be passed by the majority of the House of Representatives and the majority of the Senate. And if they both pass it by a majority, then the president signs it and it becomes a law. But there's a whole lot of steps buried in that. And those steps are important to understand. And as Americans, how we might influence that process is also important to understand. So we can talk about how associations and citizens will influence that process. But if we don't know how basically it works, it gets difficult. So let's talk about kind of the basic rules. So if a congressman or senator proposes a bill and says, "I think it ought to be a law," and the one, by the way, that we can come back to more in this conversation, in the classic Schoolhouse Rock, the law that's proposed is that school buses have to stop at railroad crossings. Sounds pretty simple and basic, and I think when they wrote that cartoon back in the day, they thought, "Oh, this is one no one's going to argue with." Well, guess what? I'm going to tell you later on that that's an unconstitutional law, that the federal government shouldn't be passing laws about school buses.
Whoa.
Not something in Article 1, Section 8. But let's leave that point off to the side and just take the basic idea. There's a rule out there that we think is a good rule, and that most people would agree with, maybe, hopefully, if we're going to pass this law. So the congressman proposes a law. It has to be assigned to a committee. And what's a committee? Well, the leaders in Congress form committees to handle different subject matter. There's a judiciary committee, there's a finance committee, there's an armed services committee. Whatever the law has to do with gets assigned to that committee. And this is where some of the real power in Congress gets exercised. The Speaker of the House, who's picked by the majority of people in his or her party. Right now, Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats have picked Nancy Pelosi, have voted for her to be the Speaker of the House. She gets to decide who gets to sit on what committees. Now, typically, traditionally, there'll be shared membership in the committees where the Democrats will have the majority if they control the House, and the Republicans have the minority. But if the Congress switches and becomes a Republican majority, those things switch around. But it's ultimately up to the Speaker of the House. She has, right now, any speaker, tremendous power to decide who gets to sit on what committees. So the committees are made up of the people who play along with the party the best. The best committee assignments, the ones that handle the difficult bills, the ones that make the biggest difference, especially things like finance,
Money,
armed services. The people who if I'm a congressman, I really want to be on that committee, because that's going to make me look great when I do great stuff with those laws. But how do I get on that committee? It's not because I'm a great knowledgeable guy about finance or the armed services. It's because I have a great relationship with the Speaker of the House who appoints those committees. And then it gets even more complicated because there's things called subcommittees that will first consider a bill, and then it goes to the full committee. And then what's even worse is that's oftentimes not even where the real decision making is made. Too often the decision making is made because the congressman on one side might get together and say, hey, what do you think about this bill? They might meet in their office, again, smoky back rooms. Other than the smoke, it's still very similar. The Congress people sit around, maybe do a Zoom meeting nowadays, maybe just meet in somebody's office. Hey, what do you think about this bill? Where are we going with this? There's different conversations that happen. And then when they kind of come to a consensus, okay, now we're ready to talk about it in committee.
Well, but hold on real quick. I want to say something, and John, you can jump in, and then I want to get right back to it. But I want, as people are listening to this, understand that I look at this as a couple of different ways. Like joints in the body, there's places for inflammation and pain, because every place that you've mentioned, it goes from an idea, boom, to subcommittee, boom, to committee. Then there's all these people that are coming into it. Those are all places where associations can apply their influence.
Correct. Associations and citizens and the political parties.
But citizens are busy. I hate to say this. This is why they get involved in associations. Everybody's working, they're trying to make a living. And I look up and go, I'm a member of this association because John Ballinger told me to be one. So we're going to blame John on this scenario. But, and all of a sudden, I don't feel I'm represented, but I don't think people see the man or the women behind the curtain that are influencing these areas. Before they walk into the subcommittee, there are people already that have talked to somebody.
Yeah, and let me,
right, John? Hold on a second.
John goes too deep in that. Let me just make an important point. So when you're talking about the associations that are up there, yeah, there's representatives from the AARP, which represents people over 50. Yes, there's people from the National Rifle Association that represents people who are interested in firearms. But unfortunately, there's also associations like the National Association of Insurance Organizations, which is made up of not citizens, but of insurance companies. And they're up there making sure there's laws are passed that are going to make sure the insurance policies are protected under the law in a way that's best for the insurance companies. So unfortunately, it's not just citizen organizations, but it's also business organizations. John, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and what I've found from being up there is that staffers do an enormous amount of back and forth in those subcommittees and those committees. And when those staffers are going back and forth, their job is to cut the deals, and then pork starts kind of coming into those bills that have nothing to do with the bill that Eric represented originally. It's like, you know what? I need some money to come back to my district. And so can we slide this into this bill? And so sometimes a bill that gets put before Congress and Senate has so much pork in it, or wording and language that has absolutely nothing to do with that when it gets passed, the words get said, we need to read it to see what's in it.
Well, and not only that, though, a lot of times, going back to what Eric said, starting off with a great idea that you can get some consensus behind, by the time it goes from that to what's actually presented, what to your point now, John, it doesn't look anything like the great idea. Or the stuff that's been attached to it, the negative outweighs the great idea. And a lot of times the people that came up with it go, I can't even support it anymore.
Yeah. So one problem we talked about in our last session that comes into play right here, let's talk about it again, the single caption bill. So the idea that when you write a law and you put the title of the law is school bus safety, under school bus safety rules, one of the ideas that would be permissible to include in that obviously would be a requirement that school buses have to stop before they cross the railroad tracks. Unfortunately, the United States Constitution and the federal government do not have a single caption bill rule. Here in Tennessee, where we are all from, Tennessee has that in their constitution. So if Tennessee wants to pass a law, they have to give it a caption related to what they're doing. And if they talk about school buses, they can't throw in there money to fix the dam. It has to be related to school buses. But the federal government, on the other hand, could have a school bus bill, and you come to me as your Tennessee congressman and say, hey, would you support this bill? I think it's going to be great. We can save a lot of kids' lives by telling school bus drivers they have to stop. Well, I'd be willing to get on board, but we've had a broken lock at the dam for so long here in Chattanooga that if you I'll vote for it if you put $4 million in the bill to fix the lock at the Chickamauga Dam. That's how these deals get made, and that's how money gets spent. because that gets added to the bill. And by the time you get enough special deals in there, there's extra money to study cow flatulence in Iowa. There's extra money to fund a new outdoor activity center at some university that's a giant playground for college kids. Whatever gets thrown into the bill, and then at the end of it, okay, now we're going to do the common sense idea, but it's going to take 875 pages to do it, and it's going to spend, several $100 million, which pretty soon that sounds like real money.
Well, what happens too is it gives the other side plenty of places to stop or argue about a really good idea. So if you're going to start adding 4 and 5 things to a good idea, then Clint goes, well, I don't agree with those 2 things. So I actually have to stand up against a good idea to prevent what may be something that I see more detrimental overall.
But that's okay, Clint. In your town, where you represent in your congressional district, we'll just make a deal that will also include $8 million for the Clint Powell Elderly Community Center and Chess Club. And then you can decide how that you get to, turn around and hand that money over to your favorite construction company in your district, the one that did the last fundraiser for you.
Nope. I just want to see bus drivers drive right through roadblocks on railroad crossings.
Yeah.
Full speed.
Yep.
No, I don't.
And this goes back to, Clint, what you just said is what John said a minute ago. What's missing in Washington, D.C., for the most part, there are a few exceptions, and there's some really good people to those few exceptions, is the selfless leadership. We have too many politicians whose number one goal is to get reelected so that they keep power and maybe continue to get donations and have business opportunities when they get out of Congress. And how do they move the ball along for themselves? They pass on the pork. They collect the pork in the bills and pass it on to their constituents. And it's rare to have a congressman say, well, wait a minute. The right thing to do here, fellas, the right thing to do here, ladies and gentlemen, is to have a clean bill that simply says school buses have to stop at railroad crossings, period, end of story. Don't put anything else in the bill. There's not enough congressmen like that anymore.
Well,
they're going to fight against that because they want to be able to hand out the fixing of the dam and the fixing of the community center and whatever John's project is for the VFW to have a helicopter in front of the building.
Well, but not only that, though, bipartisan now that's changed the definition of bipartisan, because bipartisan now is not let's me and John and Eric get together and talk about one great idea. It's let's me, Eric, and John get together and figure out how to attach the right things to a good idea that makes us all winners when we go back home to get reelected. And John, don't you think it's a lot to ask politicians to actually change I'm saying we should, but we're telling we may be telling the people that are actually benefiting from this, change it to where it's only a single item bill that can get passed, and you're going to lose your ability to build your political resume. They're not going to do that at the federal level. They're not going to change the rules to actually give them less power.
Well, it's like people that scream for term limits. It's like, so the people that have to do that are the people that are up there that are doing what we're talking about doing. Do you think they're going to do that?
And they're never going to okay it to put it on the ballot so we can vote for it.
I know.
So how do we fix that part? Do you guys have solutions? I mean, I know we've talked a little bit about it, but as a citizen listening to this, I just kind of think, I hear it and I go, okay, so they're not going to change it themselves. We're not going to get to vote on it. It's just, it is what it is.
Well, no, Sam Walton said this years ago when he went from Walton 5 and Dime to Walmart. He said what he learned when he went to the suppliers of Sears and Kmart and said, I want to buy what they're buying, but I want to buy 3 times more of it. Therefore, I want to buy it cheaper. And he said what he understood is if you want to do anything in mass proportion, you have to have leverage. And what I'm proposing is that Americans become part of an organization, an association, and that creates leverage so they can go to Washington and they can be supportive of that association's mission, which they need to completely understand, whether it's the NRA, AARP, but you need to understand your association's mission. And right now, the Association for Americans really needs to go to Washington and influence change on congressmen, senators, what I call the 4th branch, the administrative lobbyist branch. That's exactly where I would start at. I would say we're going to go up there and we're going to disrupt and say that corporations can no longer purchase their bills that being put before Congress so that they get their way from a corporation standpoint. We're going to stop that money trail.
Eric, is that possible?
It's going to be tough. I like the idea. I sure do. There's been some attempts at that, and I think there's still some remnants of some of those attempts. I think the Tea Party is one of them. There's a lot of obstacles. The obstacle number one is that a lot of the associations are the ones that are not made up of people, like the ARP and the NRA, but the ones that are the National Association of Insurance Giants, or whatever their real name is. The organizations that are made up of the big companies, they've got I think the technical term is crap ton of money.
Is it pharmaceutical companies too?
Yeah, the pharmaceutical.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, they have a lot of money, and what they can do as an association is spread that money around in political donations. And since the Citizens United case, it's been much less limited. There's more opportunity for the associations with a lot of money to spread that around. So let's go back real quick, Clinton, and finish talking about just the basic outline of how a bill becomes law and how that matters. So you have these Congress people that are fighting with each other to have the influence of being on the right committees to pass these bills up. And once it passes out of committee, then it gets sent to the floor. And if the speaker wants to have it introduced, then it can be voted on the floor. And there's some tricky votes along the way that can make those things happen. But to get the key committee assignments and to be in favor with your party and be in favor with the Speaker of the House, for example, what are the other things they can do to influence each other? It's not just always going along with the votes, which is important, but they actually contribute to each other's political action campaigns. There are Congress people who have a big stack of money that's been donated to them by the insurance industry, by the armed forces, the military industrial complex, by Boeing or whatever, by the pharmaceuticals. They have a lot of money in their war chests. And what they can do is they can spread that money around by donating from their pack to the pack of, let's say some up and comer from Brooklyn or some up and comer from Western North Carolina, and help that person get started. And then later on, when that person has had their donations made to get them started, later ends up in a committee with this key person who donated to them, how do you think their votes are going to be influenced?
Yeah.
There's a whole lot of money being internally moved around that are influencing those votes. Now, what we can do about it, what can slow that stuff or fight that stuff, is when individual citizens or other associations are actually going and doing lobbying, directly meeting their congressman and saying, hey, whoa, wait a minute. Did you really just vote to spend $100 million on the port project of the century because some congresswoman from Brooklyn asked you to do that? Why would you do that?
And they're gonna say, I did that because this great idea.
They're not going to say that because it was a great idea, because they
know the other idea.
What I'm saying is not answer the question and hope that nobody in the media is going to ask that tough question. But if you keep asking questions, at some point the news is going to come out.
No, what I'm saying is they're going to say yes to that pork belly thing that was added to it because they want to stop the buses from going through the railroad crossings.
Oh, and I had to do it because that's how the game is played.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to say, and I owed them because they did one solid for me. And there's a lot of that goes on up there. And to Eric's point, when I started studying associations back years ago, I was driving down the road thinking, so I can go by 6 gas stations that are within 1 or 2 cents of each other. So that means 6 different corporations almost have got to have the same balance sheet and expenses as each other. And that was perplexing to me because you can't go to Coke and Pepsi and say, all right, we've got everybody addicted to Coke and Pepsi. Let's charge $5 for a 2-liter because now that we've got them, there's regulations and rules and laws against that. And what I learned is there's 3 industries that can get away with what I call pure collusion. And that's the oil industry, the banking industry, and the insurance industry. They can meet, and they can meet with their associations, which they all have, and they can go to Colorado and sit around a table and say, you know what, we've got to protect our balance sheet, and we've got to protect our share price. This year we need X out of a gallon of gas. And that was never more prevalent than when the oil well exploded down in Louisiana. And that was the first time in 20 years that ExxonMobil surpassed Walmart in profitability because they didn't have the issues going on as there is BP, but they were charging. And I remember vividly, I was watching the news, and they were talking to gentlemen, and they said, now that BP's had this huge multi-million-dollar fine levied against them, what do you think about that? He said it's about time the big man got it put to him as he was putting $5 a gallon gas in his tank. And I was just thinking, how could this guy not know that he was paying for their inadequacies? But we don't understand that process. And that's what needs to go up in Washington and say, I understand this maze, this Rubik's Cube that's been created, and we're going to slowly start unwinding it, because it gets unwound when you understand the games being played. And they've tried to complicate the game so much, Clint and Eric, that they think nobody has figured it out.
I just think I look at it as the roll of tape that you can't find the end to start pulling. You're always scratching and trying to find. I don't know. So if I complain to my representative, that may be great, but at some point in time, there's going to be a valve, a door that shuts, where we're good. I feel like we've created the system where it's going to get shut on my complaint, and I can have all the knowledge about it in the world, but there's so many gatekeepers of power that it's almost like you said it, John, and I know you said it too, Eric, unless there's one big organization that has enough clout to bust through the door and go, nope, that door's not going to stay shut anymore. I don't know. This is the part where I feel like the Clint Powells and we kind of look at it and go, I just don't know what I can do. I got to work this week. I got a kid sick. I don't understand where my tax dollars are going. I'm just going to go vote for whoever I think's best. Or I may not even vote because I don't know if I've really got any influence.
Or vote for Kanye. He's going to be on the Tennessee ticket.
Me too. I'm just throwing my name in there too.
Well, I would tell you,
seriously, the Secretary of State said Kanye made he's going to be printed on there.
Yeah.
If you go back to those three organizations and look at the power that they all have with their associations, guess who pays them for what they do? The American citizens. So
you froze up. Say it again, John. You froze up.
If the American citizens understand the power they have over the insurance, the banking, and the oil industry, and say, we want someone to represent our interest in how those industries actually deliver products and services to us and the cost associated with it, so that they can't just influence it based on their balance sheet or their stock price or their need to. What I'd say, the insurance industry went from a service industry to a financial model back in the 80s. And so now everyone that pays into this $2 trillion system annually, when they have a claim, they have to fight that claim just to get paid.
Is it a consumers group then? I mean, aren't there consumer groups out there? Or do they get hijacked too?
No, they get hijacked. I actually went to the Chamber of Commerce in Washington. And if you've ever been to DC and walked in it's a full block in Washington. I walked in and I said, can you point me to who the benefits director is for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? And the lady just looked at me like, who? I said, the person in charge of all benefits for all the members of small businesses that belong to the chamber. We don't have that. And to me, when you purport yourself to be the small business champion and you have all these numbers, then you have leverage that you should be influencing change for that small business owner.
So there's no, and I want to make sure I understand it, because I love the chamber and I've been active in the chamber. There's no national chamber of commerce that has one big hammer.
That chamber of commerce is influenced by big Fortune 500 corporations, not.
There is a U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They have a big building. They have a lot of money. They have a lot of influence, and they work for the companies you recognize when you see the list of companies on the Dow Jones and the major insurance companies. They do not work for small business owners.
No.
Can I ask a really dangerous question? As a conservative, I may get in trouble with two other conservatives or liberal. And I know, Eric, you're more, a libertarian in a lot of views, which is great. I love that. I think I'm becoming that way on some issues. I've heard, there is a downside when you build your country or your life or your systems around pure greed or capitalism, right? We cover it with capitalism and not around principles. So capitalism, I love capitalism, but I think sometimes if everything is about capitalism and the power of the dollar, then we lose our principles, and that's how you get, to use your word, John, hijacked. Am I right on this? Is this capitalism run amok?
Well, I think you left one word out of it's free market capitalism, that the consumer makes a choice based on service.
And you're saying the market has been rigged.
I 100%.
It's we don't have capitalism, Clint. What people now say is bad about, quote, capitalism, they're not talking about capitalism. They're talking about crony capitalism.
That's
And
correct.
crony capitalism is one of the words that us free market people throw around to distinguish between the real capitalism of a free market where the consumer has choices and people who provide services do it in the way that's the most efficient because they're going to be providing the best product, the best service, and people are going to freely exchange their money for that product or service. Everybody succeeds under that program. Everybody has the opportunity. It's not perfect, but it is the best way to distribute resources because everybody's encouraged to provide the best resources, to provide the best product, to get paid the most for doing that. But what we don't, the whole point of what John and I have been talking about for the last two shows is the government is not doing its job to maintain free market capitalism. The government should be working like an umpire, calling balls and strikes. Now, does the government sometimes get that wrong? Sure, umpires sometimes miss a ball or a strike, but the umpire should not be on the side of the pitchers deciding that the strike zone goes from the plate to the top of the batter's helmet. And then when the other team comes to the plate, the umpire is not supposed to be on the side of the pitcher, of the batter, and saying the strike zone is only the width of his belt. And that's the problem we have with the influence in Washington, is that if enough companies have spent enough money, the umpires are no longer calling balls and strikes in the strike zone, but are picking the winners and losers by changing the rules to make it easier for some companies to get ahead. You don't need all the freaking rules we have in Washington, D.C. We don't need the giant U.S. code, and even worse, 10 times bigger than the code, the administrative state, the regulations do not need to be that big. And a whole lot of that is the government picking winners and losers instead of just doing what is fair.
And then you get to what you just said and what John's been saying. The government, really, the fourth branch, is really run by the administrators and the regulators and the people that really we've not elected and should have no real authority, but they've been put in place.
Well, and I tell you both, and I've got a diagram that I show people, and I can't do it on this in this setting, but over a 10-year period, I started putting the puzzle pieces together, and I was sitting at my desk, and it hit me one day like a bucket of water that the money that's flowing into that fourth branch, that lobbyist administrative side from those Fortune 500s, is actually being funded by the 401ks of American businesses and people. And so I say we're paying for our own demise without knowing it because we're funding the stock price that allows them to have the money to go do what they do in Washington against us. And that when it hit me, that tax code, when it started, and I saw the change when the 401k come out and how everyone jumped on board, and then how that's what really started the hijacking of America, I sat back in my chair and thought, how could we be that foolish? But we were.
Clint, we need to make that a whole topic. Retirement accounts, investment accounts, 401ks, and the amount of money that goes into the stock market is a whole separate conversation.
Well, thank goodness we're going to do a bunch of these shows.
Yeah, let's put a pin in that, Clint, if you don't mind. Remember, let's come back to that because the tax policy. I will just say this: I have a friend of mine who's doing some work on our house. We're going to sell our house, and he's a blue collar guy. I mean, he is just one of those guys who can paint and fix plaster and do that kind of stuff. And he looked at me the other day when he was here working and said, "Is Joe Biden just trying his hardest to lose this election?" Oh, what do you mean? Well, in his ad, one of the first things he says is that everybody has to wear them. He's going to make it so masks are mandatory and that we're going to tax 401ks and limit who can put money in their 401ks. This guy's getting paid by the hour to paint and put plaster on the wall, and he knows about how the economy works well enough that if you tell rich people they can't put money in their 401ks, that's not fair. And he's looking at Joe Biden supposed to be the Democrat candidate. How the heck is a blue collar guy like that ever going to vote Democrat if he can figure out how that's not on the side of the working guy? It's crazy some of the ideas that are coming out there and why they think that's a good idea. And I didn't want to get so political. I'm just giving that as an example
No.
of being able to invest your retirement money and eventually have money for a safe and secure retirement is part of the American dream. And how we get there is worth a different conversation. But to have a political party talk about limiting what people can save for retirement and taxing that money, how does that convince anybody to vote for them?
Well, we've talked about this a bunch too, and I think there'll be several things that people will hear reoccurring to all of these conversations. Is you better be very careful when you approve a mechanism or a lever that benefits your team. Right? Let me get into the thing, because your team's in power. Because as soon as your team's not in power, those same things that have been put in place can be weaponized against you. And so I'm really cautious of this. Our team's got to win this go around, because what are you sticking in the cupboard that's going to be pulled out and thrown at you later when your team's not in power? And unless you both got something to say, I want to jump back on it because I want to make sure we keep these on track. Last time we revisited Eric's version of Schoolhouse Rock, the bill was stuck in committee. Where does it go after committee, Eric, so we can wrap this part of it up?
Yeah, and actually, you just brought up a great point about how weaponizing the rules when you change them is actually part of this next step. So in the House and the Senate, they both are very similar, that the bill goes to the committee, and then once it's passed out of the committee, it goes to the floor, and then the whole Congress, the whole House of Representatives or the whole Senate votes to bring that bill to a vote. So they have vote number one: are we going to vote on this bill? They can, depending on what happens procedurally, open up the floor to proposed amendments to try to fix the bill again, to add stuff to it or take stuff away. If amendments are added, sometimes they can also have a vote whether to send the bill back to committee to be reconsidered. And then ultimately it goes to a vote. And there's a difference between the House and the Senate that I think is an important historical distinction that we're about to lose, that's going to make us an even less free country. And that is the filibuster.
Yep.
If you've ever seen the old Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, great movie. Recommend you find it somewhere online. Watch it. Old black and white, right before World War II. A Boy Scout leader gets appointed to go fill a senator's time as a Senate. When the old senator died, the governor appoints literally a Boy Scout kind of guy, a Boy Scout leader. One of the powers in the Senate is that bill gets to the floor. If you start talking about the bill in the Senate, traditionally the old rule was no time limit on how long you could speak, as long as you didn't give up your right to speak, as long as you didn't stop talking. And so there's famous stories going way back of senators who wouldn't take bathroom breaks and would actually do all kinds of tricky stuff to go talk for 20 or 30 hours, or work out a team of just a couple senators being able to switch back and forth to keep talking so that the bill would never get voted on, because the filibuster lasted long enough that everybody quit and went home. Literally things like reading the phone book into the record to not let that filibuster out. Well, so one of the changes that I don't think was a good one that happened since the 60s was the Senate fixed it so that a filibuster could be ended with a vote of 60 people. So 60 out of 100 senators could vote to end a filibuster and bring a bill to a vote. That can be used for a judge, whether the judges can be approved, that can be used for Supreme Court justices, and it can be used for bills. Well, one of the things that changed in the last few years is that when one side didn't have 60 votes, they could the side with 41 votes could hold up the approval of a new judge, and a lot of judges' nominations were held up in the Senate, and the same thing could happen with bills. But technically, whoever has the majority in the Senate can change the rules, and they called it the nuclear option. That it's such a bad change to American tradition to end the filibuster, and ultimately the Democrats approved the nuclear option of getting rid of the limit on the filibuster when it came to the appointment of judges. Well, guess what happened when the Republicans took the White House and started appointing judges? If there's no filibuster, They only need 51 votes to approve a judge, and judges are getting proved left and right that the Democrats hate. It's been used against them. They first exercised the nuclear option, and now it's being used against them. And now both sides are talking about, when we control the Senate next time, we're just going to get rid of the filibuster entirely.
I think that is scary, because there's, like you just gave, there's examples of it being used when you don't have the power. That's another way to represent the voices of the people who don't have the majority. And again, why are we allowing them? John, I wish we had your big American Citizen Association that could just bulldog their way in there like the fullback and go, hey, you two aren't playing well together. You can't do that, because that screws us.
Yeah. Well, it took me 6 years. If you do any research on me, you'll see that for 6 years I filed the IRS to create a 501c6, which is what we're talking about. And that's why I'm so passionate about this. I know it can be done. I know there's rules and regulations that allow it, but big corporations and other associations do not want this to happen.
All right, Eric, we're out of committee. Are we out of committee yet? Where are we going next?
Yeah, we got out of committee and got to the floor, and then you have the floor vote about whether or not it's going to be voted on. And in the House, it's a simple majority: yes or no, we're going to vote on this, or we can have a time for amendments. And then ultimately, if we close the amendments or don't allow for amendments, then we vote on the final bill. In the Senate, you add that extra layer of traditionally having a filibuster that can stop it from coming to a floor vote. And that's one way some bad bills historically have been stopped, and actually some good bills back in the day were stopped. And there's a lot of history behind the filibuster. If it passes the filibuster in the Senate and passes a floor vote in the House to go to a vote, then there's just a simple majority vote, 51 people in the Senate, or the majority of congressmen voting for it. If both houses vote for the same bill that's word for word the same, then it goes to the White House and is signed by the president. If they vote on a law that's similar but not the same, then it now goes to something called a conference committee, where, let's say that the House votes a bill that says all school buses have to stop in front of railroad crossings, and the Senate bill says only school buses that are full length have to stop at railroad crossings, but short buses don't have to. And now it goes to committee to decide which version of that's going to be voted on again. The committee then decides and sends it back to both houses. Or in theory, if you adopt one of the ones that's already passed one house, then the other house gets a chance to basically take that one and vote on it. And if they can't agree, then it still doesn't become a law. And so it's got to be the same law passed out of both houses.
Real quick question, though, because before we move forward, amendments, is that not another place for some influences and stuff, or amendments? Is that not adding stuff?
Rewriting the bill. It could be significant amendments.
We just blew through the amendments part, and I'm like, I think that's where a lot of people.
Amendments are happening in the committees originally, in the subcommittees. Amendments can happen in the negotiations that happen before it even gets to the subcommittees. All of that's happening all along. Eventually, it gets to the floor, and whether or more amendments are going to be allowed is something that gets voted on. And then when it gets sent back to a conference committee, more amendments are possible. And then ultimately, though, the final version of the bill that's voted on by the whole Senate and the whole House has to be the same.
But here's what happens with amendments, Eric.
Hang on. Let me finish this part, Clint. Hang on. Let's finish the basic rules.
All right.
So it gets voted on by both. They pass the same thing. The president still has to sign it. If the president refuses to sign it, then it goes back to the House and Senate to override the veto, and that takes 2/3 of each house to vote to override the veto. That's how a bill becomes a law. Now you can interrupt me, Clint.
No, well, if we don't interrupt, sometimes we get on these monologues that somehow we get 10 minutes away from a question or something and we'll forget. And so the amendments also can be used, if I'm not mistaken, if John wants to do something and we've been fighting him along the way, and I see that he is going to eventually get where he wants to, I could add an amendment that I know he is not going to agree with.
They're called poison pill amendments. So you put an amendment in there that says, for example, all school buses have to stop at railroad crossings. But if you vote for this, we're also going to defund all the VA clinics in your state. Yeah,
and part of that whole process that Eric referred to when they need those votes, that's when they really start doing some backroom deals and start adding pork to that, because the congressmen and the senators will sit back and watch that whole thing take place and watch votes. They'll hear how close they are and say, if I can be one of those three that brings money back to my district so I can slide some things in, I'm just going to sit here and be quiet so I can be one of those.
And there builds your political resume.
Yep, that's what happens.
And I promised I would cover this when I introduced the I'm Just a Bill, Yes, I'm Only a Bill. And for those of us who were kids in the 70s and watched the Schoolhouse Rock on Saturday morning, we thought, oh, what a wonderful idea. School buses have to stop before railroad crossings. My point about that now as an adult, a constitutional scholar, and an attorney is remember that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is the list of powers that Congress has, those things that Congress pass a law about. And that list of laws, that list of subject matter areas, regulating commerce between the nations and the foreign states, establishing uniform rules of nationalization, borrowing money on behalf of the United States. There are 18 things listed in Article 1, Section 8. Those are the specific things Congress is allowed to do. None of them have to do with traffic. None of them have to do with education. None of them have to do with streets within states. None of them have to do with any of those things that would allow the United States Congress to pass a law regulating whether a county or a city or a state school bus has to behave a certain way. Great example of great idea. It doesn't matter how great it is. It's not supposed to be passed by Congress because the Constitution limits the power of Congress. The state of Tennessee could do that. The state of California could do that. That's a perfectly legitimate law within the police power of a state. It's not a law that's on the list of permitted things by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution.
Well, and this is when I hear you say that, I go, it's a good idea. It's no big deal. But as soon as you do that, you set the precedent of the next thing.
As soon as you say it's no big deal to ignore the Constitution to give the federal government that power, then the federal government controls every bit of your life because there's no limit on what they can do. And they can do really, really crazy stuff like pass a mask mandate at the federal level. That's what Joe Biden's talking about asking for. I don't think they have the power to do that. That's not something the federal government has the power to do under the Constitution. It might be something the states can do, certainly, but not the federal government.
Well, when you're going to throw it out there like that against the, I'm talking about a school bus bill and you're going, well, as soon as you're going to throw out the Constitution, now I feel like, that makes people kind of go, well, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that guy. So I like it. I like the conversation, and I'm trying to find the I'm Just a Bill little clip, and I don't know if I can do it right now, but if I can, I want to see if I can do it right now. Hold on a second. We might end the show with actually showing that. That might be the last thing that we show.
Do we have a copyright problem if we include it in our show?
Probably, yeah. But nobody's watching right now. What do we care?
Okay. If anybody's stuck in there this long, they deserve to have a little Schoolhouse Rock. But they can also go find it on YouTube.
It would be from YouTube. It's a public, so whoever's posting it can get credit for it. But if I can't find it, we won't do it. You can go Google the Schoolhouse Rock. All right. So we've talked about pushing it through a bill. We didn't get to the other two things, but I love the concept of talking about your 401k and how we're actually feeding the monster that's eating us. And according to John, and then at some point in time, I would love to have a conversation about the keeping government as local as possible and comparing the state concept to the federal concept and how we've kind of tipped over on that. I think that's a good conversation.
Yeah, I agree.
Eric, would you be on board for that?
Absolutely. I think those are fun topics.
Anything we did not talk about? Oh, go ahead, John.
Before just the teaser. So during the Clinton administration, there was some discussion about Social Security running out of money, and Clinton commissioned a group of attorneys to go find a new bucket of money, and what they brought back was the retirement accounts in America that the IRS was going to have their piece of the pie on from a tax purpose. And Clinton looked at that and said, no one will ever vote to have their retirements taxed as the next bucket of money. And that's what that conversation is what created Hillary Care and the government going after the health insurance buckets of money, which created Obamacare. So that little nugget from a research standpoint.
Here's a note to self. Whenever you're talking to a guy that's in the insurance business and an attorney, and they both start smirking and smiling, it doesn't bode well.
Eric knows what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. But that goes back to also our current, one of the two major candidates is actually openly saying taxing 401ks is a good thing. And who's his audience for that? I haven't figured that out yet, but
I don't know.
Well,
maybe
the other thing, Eric, is
to talk about those things, Clint.
Well, maybe, but I also think that we're kind of we go back to the original concept, Eric, of why you and John wanted to start this. And it's not only identity politics, but there is a divide now where they have, I think, are trying to create the concept of, look how well Eric and John are doing. I should be very upset about that. I should hold them. I should be bitter. I should call that not fair, when in reality, I want people to make money, and I want people to be based on principles. And I think we're creating a generation that looks at successful people and go, we absolutely should take more of their money. Why? Because they've got it. They don't know that you both put in 80-hour weeks and had years where you've looked at your bank account going, everybody's made more money than me. They don't know that.
So another one, let's tease another future topic here, Clint, is talking about some of those things that our country has done politically, especially in the last 50 or 60 years, that is destroying the opportunities for those people, that's putting them in a position where they don't have the opportunity to live out the American dream, to be a success, to work hard and be rewarded for that hard work, so that there is fertile ground for that discord and that hate for American opportunity and American success, because they don't feel like they can be part of it. Some of that is specifically, explicitly the result of bad public policies of the last 60 years that make it harder for people to have the opportunity to live the American dream, and therefore become bitter, angry, and more likely to vote for the party that's stirring up that bitterness and anger.
And I also think part of it is what you both said. It's a lack of leadership, that a lot of leaders fuel that concept because they know, if I can get you feeling like you're a victim and I can offer you a solution that really doesn't work, I'm going to get your vote, and it feeds right back into this big cycle.
Yep.
That's my
all about power.
It is about power, and I have all the power right now. I can hit the end button, which I am about to do on this conversation. But we're going to do this again next week. Stay tuned. We got some guests coming up. We've already teased 2 topics that I think will take up probably more than one show, but I think they'll be fun topics. And next week, I'm going to find the appropriate version of Schoolhouse Rock that we won't get in trouble for, and that's what we'll kick the show off with as a recap.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Good seeing you, John. Good seeing you, Clint.
Thank you both. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see y'all next week. Bye.
Awesome. Bye.